The sticky Alabama heat clung to Sergeant Alicia Johnson's skin as she stepped off the bus, her crisp military uniform a stark contrast to the laid-back atmosphere of her hometown. She'd been away for years, serving her country with pride, but now she was back, and she wasn't alone. Beside her stood Private Tanya Williams, her fellow soldier, her best friend, and secretly, the love of her life. Alicia's heart raced as they approached her childhood home. She knew her family would be waiting, eager to welcome their daughter back. But would that welcome extend to Tanya? And more importantly, would it survive the truth Alicia was finally ready to share? Little did Alicia know, her homecoming would set in motion a chain of events that would end in tragedy, forever changing the lives of everyone involved. The Johnson family home stood proud on Magnolia Street, its white painted porch adorned with hanging baskets overflowing with vibrant flowers. As Alicia and Tanya walked up the path, the front door burst open and out rushed Alicia's mother, Evelyn. "My baby girl," Evelyn cried, enveloping Alicia in a tight embrace. "Oh, how we've missed you." Alicia hugged her mother back, fighting the lump in her throat. "I've missed you too, Mama." As they pulled apart, Evelyn's eyes fell on Tanya, who stood awkwardly to the side, her duffel bag slung over her shoulder. "And who's this?" Evelyn asked, her smile warm but curious. Alicia took a deep breath. "Mama, this is Private Tanya Williams. She's my friend from the Army. I hope it's okay, but I invited her to stay with us for a while." Evelyn's smile faltered for just a moment before returning full force. "Of course, honey. Any friend of yours is welcome here. Come on in, both of you. Your daddy and your brothers are waiting inside." As they followed Evelyn into the house, Alicia caught Tanya's eye. They shared a look of relief, but also of apprehension. This was only the beginning. Inside, Alicia's father, Robert, and her two younger brothers, Peter and Dion, were waiting. There were more hugs, more exclamations of joy and pride. Tanya was introduced, welcomed with Southern hospitality, though Alicia couldn't help but notice the questioning looks that passed between her family members. That night, as they all sat around the dinner table, the conversation flowed easily. Alicia regaled them with stories of her time in the Army, carefully editing out anything too dangerous or worrisome. Tanya chimed in occasionally, her quiet demeanor slowly giving way to a more relaxed state as the evening wore on. But as the plates were cleared and the night grew late, Alicia knew she couldn't put off the truth any longer. She cleared her throat, her hands shaking slightly under the table. "Mama, Daddy, there's something I need to tell you," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to her. Alicia felt Tanya's hand slip into hers under the table, giving her strength. "Tanya isn't just my friend," Alicia continued, her voice growing stronger. She's my girlfriend. We're in love." The silence that followed was deafening. Alicia watched as shock, confusion, and then something darker passed over her parents' faces. Her brothers looked at each other, then back at her, their expressions unreadable. It was her father who spoke first, his voice low and controlled. "Alicia, I think you and I need to have a private conversation, now." As Alicia followed her father into his study, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just lit a fuse on a bomb that was about to explode. The study door closed behind Alicia with a soft click that seemed to echo in the tense silence. Her father, Robert Johnson, stood with his back to her, his hands clasped behind him as he stared out the window into the darkness beyond. "Daddy," Alicia began, but Robert held up a hand, silencing her. When he finally turned to face her, his expression was a mixture of disappointment and barely contained anger. "How long has this been going on?" he asked, his voice eerily calm. Alicia swallowed hard. "About a year now. We met during basic training, but it wasn't until we were deployed together that That you what?" Robert interrupted, his voice rising. "That you decided to throw away everything we've taught you? Everything our church stands for?" "It's not like that, Daddy," Alicia pleaded. "I didn't choose this. It's who I am, who I've always been." Robert shook his head, his jaw clenched. No daughter of mine is gay," Alicia finished for him, a spark of defiance igniting within her. "That's what I am, Daddy. I'm gay, and I'm in love with Tanya." The sound of Robert's hand slamming against his desk made Alicia jump. "I won't hear this," he shouted. "This is just confusion, Alicia. You've been away from home, away from your roots. We'll get you help. Pastor Green can counsel you." Alicia felt tears stinging her eyes, but she blinked them back. I don't need help, Daddy. There's nothing wrong with me. Nothing wrong with loving Tanya. Robert's face hardened. As long as you're under my roof, you will not continue this sinful behavior. You will end this so-called relationship immediately. Or what? Alicia challenged, her military training kicking in, standing tall in the face of adversity. Or you and your friend can find somewhere else to stay, Robert said coldly. I won't have this in my house. Alicia felt as if she'd been slapped. She'd expected resistance, even anger. But this felt like a betrayal of everything she thought her family stood for: love, acceptance, standing by each other no matter what. You don't mean that, she whispered, her voice breaking. I've never been more serious in my life, Robert replied. You have a choice to make, Alicia. Your family or this lifestyle. With that, he brushed past her and out of the study, leaving Alicia alone with the weight of his ultimatum crushing down on her. When Alicia finally emerged from the study, her eyes red-rimmed but her spine straight, she found Tanya waiting for her in the hallway. One look at Alicia's face told Tanya everything she needed to know. We should go, Tanya said softly, reaching for Alicia's hand. Alicia nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. They quickly gathered their bags, ignoring the pleading looks from Alicia's mother and the confused questions from her brothers. As they stepped out into the warm night air, Alicia turned back one last time, hoping to see her father, to see some sign that he might change his mind. But the door remained closed, the porch light switching off as if to emphasize the finality of their departure. Where will we go? Tanya asked as they walked down the street, their duffel bags heavy on their shoulders. Alicia took a deep breath, trying to center herself. I have an old friend from high school, Keisha. She moved to Birmingham a few years back. Maybe she can put us up for a few days until we figure things out. As they walked towards the bus station, neither of them noticed the car that pulled out from a side street and began to follow them at a distance. In the driver's seat, Peter Johnson's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his face a mask of conflicting emotions as he watched his sister walk away from everything she'd ever known. The bus ride to Birmingham was quiet, both Alicia and Tanya lost in their own thoughts. Alicia's mind kept replaying the confrontation with her father, each harsh word cutting deeper with every recollection. Tanya, for her part, was battling a mix of guilt for being the catalyst of this family rift and anger at the injustice of it all. As the city lights of Birmingham came into view, Alicia stirred from her reverie. She pulled out her phone, her finger hovering over Keisha's number for a moment before she finally pressed call. Alicia? Keisha's voice came through, surprised but warm. Girl, it's been ages. How are you? Hey, Keisha, Alicia replied, trying to keep her voice steady. I need a favor. A big one. An hour later, Alicia and Tanya were standing outside a small apartment complex, their duffel bags at their feet. The door to one of the ground floor apartments opened, and out stepped Keisha, her braids swinging as she rushed to embrace Alicia. Oh, honey, Keisha said, pulling back to look at Alicia's face. What happened? Alicia's composure finally cracked, and she found herself sobbing into Keisha's shoulder, the events of the night pouring out between gasps and tears. Keisha listened, her arm around Alicia, her eyes widening as the story unfolded. When Alicia finished, Keisha turned to Tanya, who had been standing awkwardly to the side. Without a word, Keisha pulled her into the hug as well. You're both staying here, Keisha said firmly, as long as you need. The next few days were a blur of emotion for Alicia and Tanya. They spent most of their time in Keisha's spare room, alternating between planning their next steps and simply holding each other, finding comfort in their shared love amidst the storm they'd found themselves in. Keisha, true to her word, was a pillar of support. She gave them space when they needed it, but was always there with a listening ear or a home-cooked meal when the weight of their situation became too much to bear alone. It was on their fourth night in Birmingham that Alicia's phone buzzed with a text message. Her heart leapt when she saw it was from her younger brother, Dion. You okay? Mom's worried sick. Dad won't talk about it. Peter's acting is weird. Miss you. Alicia's fingers hovered over the keyboard, torn between her love for her family and her need to stand firm in her truth. Finally, she typed out a reply. I'm safe. Tell Mom I love her. I'm sorry, but I can't come home unless Dad accepts me for who I am. Love you all. She hit send before she could second-guess herself, then turned to Tanya, who was watching her with concern. We can't hide forever, Alicia said softly. We need to start building our own life. Tanya nodded, taking Alicia's hand in hers. Together, she said, her voice full of determination. The next morning, they sat down with Keisha at her small kitchen table, laptops open and notepads ready. Okay, Keisha said, her tone businesslike. Let's figure this out. You've both got your military experience. What kind of work are you looking for? As they began to discuss job options and apartment hunting, none of them noticed the car parked across the street or the man inside watching the apartment with narrowed eyes. As days turned into weeks, Alicia and Tanya slowly began to carve out a life for themselves in Birmingham. With Keisha's help and their military backgrounds, they both managed to secure jobs, Alicia as a security consultant for a local firm, and Tanya as a physical trainer at a nearby gym. They found a small apartment not far from Keisha's place, a cozy one-bedroom that they filled with second-hand furniture and the beginnings of their shared dreams. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. And for the first time since that fateful night at the Johnson family home, they felt like they could breathe again. But even as they settled into their new routine, Alicia couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She'd catch glimpses of a familiar-looking car on her way to work, or feel eyes on her back as she and Tanya walked hand in hand through the park on weekends. At first, she dismissed it as paranoia, the lingering effects of her family's rejection. But as the days wore on, the feeling only intensified. One evening, as they were walking home from a dinner date, Tanya suddenly gripped Alicia's arm tightly. Don't look now, Tanya whispered, but I think that car has been following us since we left the restaurant. Alicia's military instincts kicked in. Without turning her head, she guided Tanya down a side street, then another, taking a circuitous route back to their apartment. The car remained a constant presence, always a few blocks behind, never quite close enough to confront. When they finally reached their building, they rushed inside, locking the door behind them. Alicia peered out the window, her heart pounding, and caught a glimpse of the car as it drove slowly past their building. Did you see who was driving? Tanya asked, her voice shaky. Alicia shook her head. No, but I've seen that car before. I thought I was imagining things, but... What do we do? Tanya's eyes were wide with fear. Alicia took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing thoughts. We need to be smart about this. We'll start varying our routines, taking different routes to work. And we should tell Keisha, maybe see if she's noticed anything strange. That night, as they lay in bed, neither of them able to sleep, Alicia's phone buzzed with another text from Dion. Peter's been acting real strange. Keeps disappearing for hours. Mom's worried about him too now. Wish you were here, sis. Alicia stared at the message, a cold feeling settling in her stomach. Could it be? She thought back to the car she'd seen, trying to place why it had seemed so familiar. With a jolt, she realized it looked just like Peter's old Chevy, the one he'd been so proud of fixing up himself. Tanya, Alicia whispered, shaking her girlfriend gently. I think I know who's been following us. As Alicia explained her suspicions, Tanya's face grew pale. But why? She asked. What does he want? Alicia shook her head, uncertainty and fear warring within her. I don't know, but I'm gonna find out. The next morning, Alicia called in sick to work. She spent hours pacing their small apartment, debating what to do. Should she confront Peter? Call the police? Try to reason with him? In the end, she decided to reach out to the one person who might be able to help her understand what was going on, her mother. With shaking hands, she dialed the number she knew by heart. It rang once, twice, 3 times before a familiar voice answered. Alicia? Her mother's voice was a mixture of surprise and relief. Oh baby, is that you? Hi Mama, Alicia said, fighting back tears. We need to talk about Peter. The conversation with her mother left Alicia feeling more unsettled than ever. Evelyn Johnson had been both overjoyed to hear from her daughter and deeply troubled by the news about Peter. He's changed, Alicia, Evelyn had said, her voice heavy with worry. Ever since you left, he's been angry, distant. Your father thinks it's just him processing everything. But I'm scared, baby. I'm scared for all of us. Alicia had wanted to tell her mother about the car following them, about her suspicions, but something held her back. Maybe it was the fear of causing her mother more pain, or maybe it was the lingering hope that she was wrong, that there was some other explanation for Peter's behavior. As she hung up the phone, Tanya wrapped her arms around Alicia from behind, resting her chin on Alicia's shoulder. "What are you thinking?" Tanya asked softly. Alicia leaned back into the embrace, drawing strength from Tanya's presence. "I'm thinking we need to confront this head-on. No more hiding, no more running. If Peter's here, if he's the one following us, we need to know why." Tanya nodded, her grip tightening slightly. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you, always." They spent the rest of the day planning, going over every possible scenario. They decided to set a trap, to draw out whoever was following them, and force a confrontation on their own terms. The next evening, they put their plan into action. They made a show of leaving their apartment, dressed up as if for a night out. But instead of heading to a restaurant or club, they made their way to a quiet, well-lit park nearby. As they walked hand in hand down the park's main path, Alicia's eyes scanned their surroundings, every sense on high alert. And then she saw it. The familiar outline of Peter's car, parked just outside the park's entrance. "He's here," Alicia whispered to Tanya, giving her hand a squeeze. They continued walking until they reached a small clearing, surrounded by trees but still visible from the main path. There, they stopped and turned to face the direction they'd come from. "Peter," Alicia called out, her voice echoing in the quiet park. "I know you're there. Come out, let's talk." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, a figure emerged from the shadows of the trees. As he stepped into the light, Alicia's suspicions were confirmed. It was indeed her brother Peter. But the Peter that stood before her was almost unrecognizable from the brother she remembered. His face was gaunt, his eyes wild and bloodshot. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Peter," Alicia said, her voice softer now, tinged with concern. "What are you doing here?" Peter's gaze darted between Alicia and Tanya, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. When he spoke, his voice was rough, almost a growl. "I came to bring you home, Alicia," he said, "to fix this, to fix our family." Alicia took a step forward, her hands raised in a placating gesture. "Peter, there's nothing to fix. This is who I am. Tanya is who I love. Coming home won't change that." Peter shook his head violently. "No, you don't understand. It's her fault." He pointed at Tanya, his finger shaking. "She turned you against us, against everything we believe in." "That's not true, Peter," Tanya said, her voice calm despite the fear Alicia could see in her eyes. "I love your sister. I would never try to turn her against her family." "Liar," Peter shouted, and suddenly there was a gun in his hand, pointed directly at Tanya. Time seemed to slow down. Alicia saw Tanya's eyes widen in shock, saw Peter's finger tighten on the trigger. Without thinking, she threw herself forward, pushing Tanya out of the way just as the gun went off. Pain exploded in Alicia's shoulder as the bullet found its mark. She stumbled, falling to her knees. She could hear Tanya screaming, could see Peter's face contort in horror as he realized what he'd done. As darkness began to creep in at the edges of her vision, Alicia's last thought was of the irony. She'd survived war zones only to be shot by her own brother in a park in Alabama. Then everything went black. The steady beep of a heart monitor was the first thing Alicia became aware of as she slowly regained consciousness. Her eyelids felt heavy, but she forced them open, blinking against the harsh fluorescent lights of what she quickly realized was a hospital room. "Alicia? Baby, can you hear me?" Tanya's face swam into view, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy from crying, but filled with relief as she saw Alicia awake. "Tanya," Alicia croaked, her throat dry and scratchy. "What? What happened?" Tanya's hand found hers, squeezing gently. "You were shot, love. Do you remember?" The memories came flooding back. The park, Peter, the gun. Alicia tried to sit up, wincing at the pain that shot through her shoulder. "Easy," Tanya said, gently pushing her back down. "The doctor said you need to rest. The bullet missed anything vital, but you lost a lot of blood." "Peter," Alicia said, the name coming out as half question, half statement. Tanya's face darkened. "He's been arrested. After he shot you, he just stood there like he couldn't believe what he'd done. I called 911, and the police arrived pretty quickly. They took him into custody without any resistance." Alicia closed her eyes, feeling tears start to form. Her own brother had shot her. How had things gone so terribly wrong? A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened her eyes to see a police officer standing in the doorway. "Miss Johnson? I'm Detective Carter. I know you've been through a lot, but if you're feeling up to it, I need to ask you a few questions about what happened." Alicia nodded, and with Tanya's help, managed to sit up a bit straighter in the bed. As she recounted the events in the park, she could see the detective's face grow increasingly grave. "Miss Johnson," Detective Carter said when she had finished, "I want you to know that we're taking this very seriously. Your brother is facing charges of attempted murder and hate crime." The words hit Alicia like a physical blow. Hate crime. She'd never imagined those words could apply to her own family. What's going to happen to him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's largely up to the district attorney now," Detective Carter replied. "But given the severity of the charges and the evidence we have, he's looking at significant prison time." As the detective left, promising to keep them updated on the case, Alicia felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. Tanya must have noticed because she leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to Alicia's forehead. "Rest now, love," Tanya murmured. "I'll be right here." Alicia drifted off to sleep, her dreams a confused jumble of childhood memories and the terrifying events in the park. She was awakened sometime later by the sound of raised voices outside her room. She recognized one immediately, her father. "I don't care what the rules are, that's my daughter in there." The door burst open, and Robert Johnson strode in, followed closely by Evelyn and a harried-looking nurse. "Sir, please, you can't just—" the nurse began, but Robert cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Alicia," he said, his voice breaking as he took in the sight of his daughter in the hospital bed. "Oh, my baby girl." Alicia felt Tanya tense beside her, ready to intervene if necessary. But to everyone's surprise, Robert didn't lash out or start preaching. Instead, he collapsed into the chair on the other side of Alicia's bed, his head in his hands. "I'm so sorry," he sobbed, his shoulders shaking. "This is all my fault. If I'd just—" Evelyn moved to stand behind her husband, her hand on his shoulder as she looked at Alicia with tears in her eyes. "We were wrong, baby," she said softly. "So wrong. Can you ever forgive us?" Alicia looked from her parents to Tanya, seeing the same shock and disbelief she felt mirrored in her girlfriend's face. She took a deep breath, wincing slightly at the pain in her shoulder. It's going to take time," she said finally. "What happened, what Peter did, it didn't come from nowhere. But," she paused, reaching out to take her father's hand, "I'm willing to try if you are." Robert looked up, his eyes red and swollen. He nodded, then turned to look at Tanya. "I owe you an apology too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I judged you without knowing you, without giving you a chance. I'm sorry." Tanya nodded, her expression guarded but not hostile. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson. That means a lot." As the Johnsons settled in, the nurse having given up on enforcing visiting hours, Alicia felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead would be long and difficult, dealing with Peter's actions, healing both physically and emotionally, rebuilding trust with her family. But for the first time since that night, she'd come out to her parents. She felt like maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. She squeezed Tanya's hand, drawing strength from the woman she loved. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The months following the shooting were a whirlwind of doctor's appointments, physical therapy sessions, and meetings with lawyers. Alicia's shoulder healed slowly but steadily, leaving behind a scar that served as a constant reminder of how close she'd come to losing everything. Through it all, Tanya remained by her side, a steady presence that Alicia leaned on more than she'd ever thought possible. And to Alicia's surprise and cautious joy, her parents were there too, making tentative steps towards rebuilding their relationship. Robert and Evelyn had moved temporarily to Birmingham to be closer to Alicia during her recovery. It wasn't always easy. Years of ingrained beliefs and prejudices didn't disappear overnight. There were awkward silences, heated arguments, and moments when it seemed like the fragile peace might shatter. But there were good moments too. The first time Robert asked Tanya about her job, showing genuine interest. The afternoon, Evelyn spent teaching them both her secret recipe for peach cobbler. The night they all stayed up late, looking through old photo albums and sharing stories, laughter mixing with tears as they confronted the past and cautiously looked towards the future. As Alicia's body healed, she found herself grappling with conflicting emotions about Peter. On one hand, she was angry, furious even, at what he'd done. The betrayal cut deep, leaving wounds that no amount of physical therapy could heal. But on the other hand, he was still her brother. She couldn't help but remember the little boy who'd followed her around when they were kids, who'd cried when she left for basic training, who'd always been there to defend her on the playground. It was this internal conflict that made the approach of Peter's trial so difficult. As the date drew nearer, Alicia found herself plagued by nightmares, reliving the moment in the park over and over again. The morning of the trial dawned bright and clear. A beautiful day that seemed at odds with the somber mood that had settled over the Johnson family. Alicia stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her blazer and trying to calm her nerves. Tanya appeared behind her, wrapping her arms around Alicia's waist and resting her chin on Alicia's good shoulder. "You ready for this?" Tanya asked softly. Alicia took a deep breath, meeting Tanya's eyes in the mirror. "As ready as I'll ever be." The courthouse was a flurry of activity when they arrived. Reporters clustered outside, shouting questions as Alicia and Tanya made their way up the steps, flanked by Robert and Evelyn. Alicia kept her head down, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. Inside, the courtroom was hushed, the air heavy with tension. Alicia's breath caught in her throat when she saw Peter for the first time since that night in the park. He looked small in his orange jumpsuit, his eyes downcast as he sat next to his lawyer. As the trial began, Alicia listened with a sense of surreal detachment as the lawyers presented their cases. The prosecution painted a picture of a hate-filled attack, emphasizing Peter's actions as a targeted assault on Alicia because of her sexuality. The defense argued for diminished capacity, claiming that Peter had been in a state of extreme emotional distress, pushed to the breaking point by family tensions and his own internal struggles. When it was Alicia's turn to testify, she took the stand with shaking legs but a steady voice. She recounted the events of that night, describing the fear she'd felt when she saw the gun, the split-second decision to push Tanya out of the way, the searing pain of the bullet. "Miss Johnson," the prosecutor asked, "in your opinion, why did your brother shoot you?" Alicia paused, her eyes finding Peter's across the courtroom. For the first time since the trial began, he looked up, meeting her gaze. In that moment, Alicia saw not the man who had shot her, but the little brother she'd grown up with, scared and confused and desperately in need of help. "I think," Alicia said slowly, choosing her words carefully, "that my brother was scared. Scared of change, scared of what he didn't understand. I think he thought he was protecting our family, our way of life. But he was wrong. Love isn't something to be afraid of, no matter what form it takes." The trial lasted for 2 weeks, each day bringing new testimonies, new evidence, new emotional upheavals. Tanya testified about the terror of watching Alicia fall, about the frantic minutes trying to stop the bleeding while waiting for the ambulance to arrive. Robert and Evelyn spoke about the family dynamics leading up to the shooting, their voices heavy with regret as they acknowledged their role in creating an environment of intolerance. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the jury reached a verdict. As the foreman stood to read it, Alicia gripped Tanya's hand tightly, her other hand clasped in her mother's. "On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, we find the defendant, Peter Johnson, guilty." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Alicia felt her mother's hand tighten around hers and heard her father's sharp intake of breath. "On the charge of committing a hate crime, we find the defendant, Peter Johnson, guilty." Alicia closed her eyes, a mix of relief and sorrow washing over her. It was over. Peter would face the consequences of his actions, but at what cost to their family? As the judge prepared to hand down the sentence, Peter's lawyer stood up. "Your Honor, before you pass sentence, my client would like to make a statement." The judge nodded and Peter stood, his hands shaking as he unfolded a piece of paper. "Alicia," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. I know that doesn't begin to cover what I did, what I almost took from you. I was wrong. So wrong. I let fear and ignorance guide my actions, and I'll have to live with that for the rest of my life. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that I'm going to use my time in prison to educate myself, to become better. I hope that one day I can be the brother you deserve." As Peter sat back down, Alicia felt tears streaming down her face. She looked at Tanya, saw her own mix of emotions reflected in her girlfriend's eyes. The judge's voice cut through the emotional fog. "Peter Johnson, for the crimes of attempted murder and commission of a hate crime, I hereby sentence you to 25 years in state prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. As the gavel came down, Alicia felt a strange sense of closure. It wasn't a happy ending. How could it be, with her brother going to prison? But it was an ending, a chance to close this painful chapter and start anew. Outside the courthouse, surrounded by her parents and Tanya, Alicia faced the sea of reporters. Taking a deep breath, she stepped up to the microphones. "Today, justice was served," she began. "But this isn't a victory. There are no winners here, only lessons to be learned. Hate and fear can destroy families, tear apart communities. But love can heal. It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight. But I believe that with understanding, with compassion, we can build a world where no one has to fear being who they are or loving who they love." As the cameras flashed and the reporters shouted questions, Alicia turned away, wrapping her arm around Tanya's waist. Together, surrounded by the family that had come so close to being torn apart forever, they walked down the courthouse steps and into whatever the future might hold. The years following Peter's trial were a time of healing and growth for the Johnson family. Alicia and Tanya settled into their life in Birmingham, their relationship growing stronger with each passing day. They bought a small house with a backyard, adopted a rescue dog named Buddy, and began to talk about starting a family of their own. Robert and Evelyn, true to their word, worked hard to educate themselves and overcome their prejudices. They attended PFLAG meetings, read books about LGBTQ+ experiences, and even marched in their first Pride Parade, holding a sign that read, "We love our gay daughter." It wasn't always easy. Old habits die hard, and there were still moments of tension and misunderstanding. But the love they had for their daughter and their determination to make things right carried them through the rough patches. Alicia's recovery, both physical and emotional, was a long and sometimes painful process. The scar on her shoulder served as a constant reminder of that night in the park. But with time, it became a symbol of her strength and resilience. She started volunteering at a local LGBTQ+ youth center, using her experiences to help other young people struggling with family acceptance. Tanya, ever supportive, threw herself into advocacy work. She started a support group for partners of LGBTQ+ individuals who had experienced family rejection or violence. Her gentle demeanor and unwavering commitment to love and acceptance made her a pillar of strength for many in their community. As for Peter, his journey was perhaps the most difficult of all. Prison was hard, as it is for most, but true to his word, he used his time to educate himself. He joined support groups, read extensively about LGBTQ+ issues, and even started a program to help other inmates confront their own biases and prejudices. Alicia's relationship with Peter was complicated. For the first year after the trial, she couldn't bring herself to visit him. The memory of that night in the park, the fear and betrayal she had felt, was still too raw. But as time passed, and with encouragement from both Tanya and her parents, Alicia finally agreed to see her brother. That first visit was tense and awkward. Neither Alicia nor Peter quite knew what to say. But as the visits continued, a fragile bridge began to form between them. Peter's remorse was genuine, his efforts to change sincere. Slowly, cautiously, Alicia allowed herself to hope that one day they might truly be family again. 5 years after the shooting, Alicia and Tanya decided to get married. The proposal was simple and sweet. A quiet evening at home. Buddy curled up at their feet when Tanya got down on one knee and asked Alicia to spend the rest of their lives together. Alicia's yes was immediate and joyful. The wedding planning brought its own set of challenges. There was the question of whether to invite Peter. He was still in prison, but could potentially get a day release for the ceremony. After much discussion and soul-searching, Alicia and Tanya decided to include him. It was a step towards forgiveness, towards the future they hoped to build. The day of the wedding dawned bright and clear. The ceremony was held in the backyard of Alicia and Tanya's home, strings of lights twinkling in the trees. Alicia wore a sleek white suit, Tanya a flowing sundress. As they stood before their friends and family, ready to say their vows, Alicia caught sight of Peter, seated between two guards, tears streaming down his face. Robert walked Alicia down the aisle, his face a mix of pride and lingering regret. As he placed Alicia's hand in Tanya's, he leaned in and whispered, "I'm so sorry it took me so long to see how beautiful this is." The reception was a joyous affair, filled with laughter, dancing, and love. Even Peter was allowed to join for a short while, awkwardly but sincerely congratulating the newlyweds before being escorted back to prison. As the night wound down, Alicia and Tanya found a quiet moment alone. They stood on the porch, looking out at their guests, the family that had almost torn them apart now mingling happily with their chosen family of friends and supporters. "Did you ever think we'd get here?" Tanya asked, leaning her head on Alicia's shoulder. Alicia wrapped her arm around her wife, pulling her close. "Honestly, there were times I didn't, but I'm so glad we did." "Me too," Tanya said softly. "So Mrs. Johnson-Williams, what's next for us?" Alicia smiled, thinking of the adoption papers they had started filling out, of the LGBTQ+ youth center they dreamed of opening, of the lifetime of love stretching out before them. "Whatever it is," she said, "we'll face it together." As they rejoined their guests, Alicia caught her father's eye across the yard. He raised his glass to her, a silent toast to the journey they had all taken, to the love that had ultimately conquered fear and prejudice. It hadn't been an easy road, and there were surely more challenges ahead. But standing there, surrounded by love and acceptance, Alicia knew that they had the strength to face whatever came their way. Their story of love, tragedy, forgiveness, and hope would go on, a testament to the power of understanding and the enduring strength of the human heart.